thinking that we left off midway through chapter 3 of Flat Stanley. So what do you say we continue the chapter? Guys, when we left off, Stanley's brother, Arthur, was feeling a little jealous of Stanley's flatness. And so Stanley decided that he would be kind and be a kite for Arthur. Now, a few of you made some predictions, and I have your prediction here. Marco, you predicted that Arthur will let the kite go. Soon we'll find out. Cece, you predicted that everyone else flying kites will be jealous of Arthur's kite. Well, we'll soon find out. The rest of you, sweeties, keep your predictions in your head, and let's see what is the outcome, okay? Well, on page 30, it says, Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambtop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice while he was eating the hot dog that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening. And at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. You're at the office all day having fun, she said. You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult. Kids are like that, Mr. Lambchop said. Faces. Be patient, dear. Chapter 4. The Museum Thieves. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the Lambchops. Mr. Dart was an important man, the director of the famous Museum of Art downtown in the city. Stanley Lambchop had noticed in the elevator that Mr. Dart, who was ordinarily a cheerful man, had become quite gloomy, but he had no idea what the reason was. And then at breakfast one morning, he heard Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop talking about Mr. Dart. I see, said Mr. Lambchop, reading the paper over his coffee cup, that still another painting has been stolen from the famous museum. It says here that Mr. O.J. Dart, the director, is at his wit's end. Oh dear, are the police no help? Mrs. Lambchop asked. It seems not, said Mr. Lambchop. Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We suspect a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying. Meanwhile, I hope people will buy tickets for the policeman's ball and not park their cars where signs say don't. The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. These sneak thieves work at night, Mr. Dart said. It is very hard for our guards to stay awake when they have been on duty all day. And the famous museum is so big, we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. Suddenly, as if an electric light bulb had lit up in the air above his head, giving out little shooting lines of excitement, Stanley Lamb-Chop had an idea. He told it to Mr. Dart. Now, sweetie pies, we're going to stop there for today. Now I want you to predict. I want you to think. I want you to infer. What do you think Stanley's bright idea is? What will he share with Mr. Dart? Until next time, bye guys.